Yeah, I don't think Chipotle's results match up to PayPal's, but considering it's a restaurant and it's a pandemic, they were pretty darn good. Let me cover the highlights. The other thing that's interesting is now we're lapping if you remember, the E. coli stuff is actually 5 years ago. So I have about 22 quarters of results that we're going to buzz through in some charts and kind of show you sort of what life was like pre-COVID and pre-E. coli 5 years ago. The stock has tripled since then, but I don't think the results match up to where the stock has run. Revenue increased 11.6 to 1.6 billion. Comparable restaurant sales 5.7% comparable restaurant sales in any economy in even non-pandemic times is enviable. My feeling is they're taking market share because they're open, because they have digital sales, which is now almost 50% of its total sales. The only trouble is restaurant level margins were flat to last quarter at about a 19.5%. It's considerably down from where it was pre-E. coli, and we'll talk a little bit about that. They've had extra charges for dealing with coronavirus, sending people out sick. The delivery business is now about a quarter of all sales. And that's causing them some extra, and any delivery sale is about break even. It's good for the top line sales of the restaurant, but it hurts margins, as well as they've seen a decrease in things like catering and drink sales, which are also highly margin things, which are impacting margins a little bit. They're starting to play around with pricing to charge more for delivery orders, and have seen a little bit resistance on that, but they're going to continue to do that. The other thing that's pretty interesting is they're not sitting still. They're looking at brisket. They're looking at new menu items, and they have about 170 Chipotle lanes, which are essentially drive-through restaurants where you digitally order and you can pick up your stuff. They're usually a hybrid. They're not a digital only. And those restaurants see about a 10% bump. Instead of 50% of sales, they're about 60% of sales through those restaurants. And the digital sales where a end consumer picks up the food is a much better margin for Chipotle. It takes less time to build the order, and they don't have to pay the delivery fees. So let's take a quick look at the business over the last couple of years. This is going to be lightning fast. So here we are with, let me start with revenue. Revenue's not bad. So this first quarter, everything starts with Q3 2015, and at the end of Q3, it's like the last week of October, they had their first E. coli news. The news broke out, so it really didn't impact the Q3, but you can see the revenue dropped considerably in Q4, and then it bottomed out in Q1 later. It's doubled from its bottom to the latest quarter, but you really need to look at sort of pre-E. coli times. It's only up about 30% in total quarterly revenue, where the stock has tripled. Let's look at average restaurant sales. Average restaurant sales dropped down to 187 and are up to 222, but it's still 12% below the average restaurant sales pre-E. coli times. Digital revenue is a whole different deal, off the charts. They didn't start tracking that or releasing data until Q3 2016. It was in the single low digits before then, but you can see it popped up in the first quarter or the second quarter as most restaurants closed and whatnot. Today they have about 60% of their restaurants open, and the digital sales is still about stable at half. This is the number of
Can you hold that for a
stores. It's
second,
gone from
Hugh?
1931 up to 2768. What's interesting in the last 2 quarters, even with the pandemic, they've added 100 stores. They're pressing on the gas. They're looking at doing 200 stores next year. Their long-term goal is 6,000, and they want to get the average restaurant sales back up to this number, 2.5 million. Same store sales have been kind of quirky depending on the year's comps. The last 2 quarters have been super solid. Q2 was kind of low. Actually, having all its restaurants closed for a period of time in Q2 and only losing 10% of sales is actually pretty amazing. Here's where the rubber meets the road, though. This is store level. There's a lot to take in here. The store level margins. Prior to when Chipotle was a Wall Street darling, this was their cost structure. 72% of costs, which means that the restaurant level margins were at a industry leading 28%. As costs went up for food safety and whatnot, you can see the food went up, the blue bar when food went up. But recently, the last 2 quarters, this other costs have gone up, and that's really related to delivery charges, and that gets offset a little bit in the price. But they're going to have a hard time figuring out this labor cost is 25%. It's nowhere near the 22%, and I think they're going to be pressured for labor, and unless they can do more Chipotle lanes, it's only 170 of their how many ever stores, 2,700 stores, so it's a really small portion. This labor business, when the stores open back up, it's going to be tough, as well as I think there's going to be in the restaurant industry in general is going to struggle with labor, raising labor costs. So that's what I got.
Can you just go back to that chart that showed the digital sales as percentage of the total?
Oh yeah,
that's a great chart.
This is amazing.
The interesting question that I have is, I mean, obviously look at the enormous spike, but pre-COVID, it was 26% or, 20%, depending on which quarter you're going to look at. But
yeah.
if you're going to say what behaviors are changing for humanity as a result of COVID, I mean, I think that 50% is probably pretty darn sustainable. If apps on your phone, it's just push a button, repeat order, done. It's like so simple.
The interesting piece, they've talked about the Venn diagram of in-store eaters and order on the app eaters were like this, and now it's going to come like this. They expect that 85% of their digital orders, they're going to keep those customers who are doing the digital order. And the other thing that's going to happen is they're going to add back lunch. They didn't talk about the percentage of sales, in the lunch window, but you think about people working from home and whatnot, you're not going to get together with colleagues and go, hey, let's go to Chipotle for lunch. It just isn't happening. So there's certainly some levers that are going to get better, like the drink sales and lunch sales and things, and people coming back in the restaurant for what they call occasions. But again, the stock tripled and the revenue went up 30%. So, and the margins are worse than they were prior to them 5 years ago. So I think it's going to be difficult for them to see the same kind of 10-year stock performance that they've had, continue that going forward.
Well, hey Brian, you remember we were saying a minute ago, remember when PayPal was a tiny part of eBay? You remember who Chipotle used to be a tiny part of?
MCD, Mickey D's.
McDonald's. Do you know how much McDonald's got rid of Chipotle for?
Oh, I can't remember. It was like
a couple $100 million.
Well, yeah. What's Chipotle's share price right now?
1,200, 1,600 maybe.
Yeah. 1,600. McDonald's IP spun off Chipotle at $22 a share.
22.
In 2006.
Thanks, Mickey D's.